What we talk about in economics in terms of purchasing power parity, I know that's a mouthful, PPP, purchasing power parity. And in theory, in the long run, prices, once adjusted for the exchange rate, should be equal. Now, of course, there are certain conditions. One of those conditions is the availability of arbitrage. Arbitrage is an important word, one that you need to know as a part of this class and will be on the final exam. Arbitrage is the profits that could be made from moving a good or service from one market to another. It's also the profits that can be made from moving people from one market to another. So if you're able to buy a product cheaper by going to a different location, that would be a form of arbitrage. On the other hand, if you move a good from one city to another because that good is more expensive in the other city and you make a profit by doing that, that would be another form of arbitrage. If there's a lack of arbitrage, then the purchasing power parity may not exist. The other factor that can influence purchasing power parity is high transaction costs. So we've talked about transaction costs. We know that the first one is search, the cost to find a partner to trade with. The second is bargaining, determining the price that both sides are willing to pay. The third is contracting, the cost to set up the terms of the deal. And the fourth is the transfer costs, which would include transportation and so forth. So if the transaction costs are high, it's possible that you may not have purchasing power parity. Let me give you an example. When we moved here to Indiana, my wife, who was used to having a stylist do her hair, wanted a particular type of stylist that would be comparable to what she had before in California. Well, she's not going to find somebody like Sherry. Sherry was spectacular. She was a great stylist. She was also very, very expensive. But Sherry isn't here in Indiana. So my wife can't have Sherry. Why? Because the transaction costs are too high. We would have to fly Sherry here whenever she wanted a haircut, put her up in a hotel, and reimburse her for all of her lost revenues. Well, that's not going to happen. So instead, she found somebody in Indianapolis that was trained to do the same kind of thing, who isn't quite as good, but he doesn't charge as much either. So the idea is that if you have arbitrage and you have very low transaction costs, you should have purchasing power parity. Now, let me talk to you quickly about a version of this. The Economist magazine every year puts out something they call the Big Mac Index. The Big Mac Index is taking something that we all think of as a commodity, the Big Mac hamburger, and the Big Mac is made pretty much the same in every location. It's hamburger and cheese, and I don't know what else is on it, but there's some little song that goes with it. And so the Big Mac's a great example of something we can use to test purchasing power parity. So what they do is they go to McDonald's stores all over the world. They convert the dollar into the local currency, and then they buy a Big Mac or several Big Macs at those stores. And they're looking to see, does the same amount of dollars that buys a Big Mac in the US, when it's converted into the other currency, will it buy a Big Mac in that country? And the answer is, in general, yes. It does work out to be pretty accurate. I don't know, maybe they're $3 or $4 here, and maybe in some countries they might be $5. In other countries they might be $2.90, but there's not a lot of discrepancy between them. So from the last time I looked, the busiest McDonald's location in the world was in Russia. And evidently this particular location in Russia has something like 100 checkout stations and unbelievable numbers of employees back there making Big Macs and other McDonald's food. And it's It's such that many of the Russian people have to save up money for a long period of time in order to have enough to be able to go out to dinner at McDonald's. Well, there is a difference in the price between here and Russia. Not a lot of difference, but some difference. So the question is why? Why and what might make a difference? I mean, it's hamburger, it's cheese, it's a bun, some secret sauce, a few things. Why would there be much difference? Well, so put on your economist glasses, put on your economist hat, and think about this for a minute. What would be different in Russia than here? So you might be thinking, oh, I know, real estate prices are lower, and that would be a good point. If real estate prices are lower, then they can charge less for the Big Mac hamburgers there because they don't have to pay as much rent. Okay, well, maybe salaries and wages are lower there. Oh, yes, for sure. So if they pay lower wages, then they don't have to charge as much for the Big Mac there. Hamburger, on the other hand, might be really expensive in Russia since they don't have a lot of beef. So they may have to pay a premium to get the hamburger brought in. So you get the idea. Some things could drive the prices up, some could drive it down. There may be some variance, but it's not going to be that much that great in variance. Let's now talk about the law of one price. So the law of one price is very closely related to purchasing power parity. And I just want to give a little bit more insight into this. So the law of one price says that the same good, all things being equal, should have the same price no matter where it's being sold, as long as there are certain things in place. Well, what are those things? Well, obviously, we talked about arbitrage, that the goods need to be able to flow. We talked about transaction costs, that if the transaction costs are low. But there are a couple of other things that can influence it, and one of those is political barriers. So governments can put up barriers to trade, and if they do, that's going to destroy the law of one price or the purchasing power parity. And those trade barriers can be myriad. There's all kinds of different barriers that can be put up. Another, of course, is the lack of perfect substitutes. I talked about this earlier when I spoke about my wife's stylist. She has no perfect substitutes, but there are substitutes. They're just not perfect substitutes. And so the lack of perfect substitutes will cause some variation in price as well.